The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow-deep in soil, pulling up the last of the season's carrots. I almost didn't answer. I had been ignoring calls from that number for 7 months, and I had gotten very good at it, but something made me pull off my glove and swipe the screen. My mother's voice came through sharp and clear, the way it always did when she wanted something. She never said hello. She never asked how I was. She just started talking as if our conversation had merely been paused for a few minutes, rather than left to rot for most of a year. "We need to talk about your grandmother's property," she said. "There are decisions being made and you need to be there." I stood in the middle of my vegetable garden in rural Prince Edward Island, mud on my knees and frost in the air, and I said nothing for a long moment. "What decisions?" I finally asked. "Just come," she said. And she hung up. I should tell you something about my family before I go any further, because none of what happened next makes sense without it. I am the second child and only daughter of a woman who believed, with her whole heart, that sons carried families forward, and daughters were temporary residents until they married and disappeared into someone else's name. My brother Callum was 4 years older than me, and from the time I could understand what was happening around me, I understood that he was the one who mattered. His hockey equipment came first, his tuition was paid, his ideas at the dinner table were taken seriously. When I got into the environmental science program at Dalhousie on a partial scholarship, my mother told me that was nice, and then spent the next 40 minutes on the phone, congratulating Callum for getting a promotion at the insurance brokerage, where he had worked for 3 years. I do not say this to ask for your sympathy. I stopped needing that a long time ago. I say it only because the phone call on that Tuesday morning was not a surprise to me. Nothing my mother did surprised me anymore. What surprised me was myself, that after everything I still got in the car. My grandmother's name was Estelle, and she had died 8 months earlier at the age of 81 peacefully, in the home she had owned for 43 years outside of Charlottetown. She had been a market gardener her entire adult life. Tomatoes, brassicas, root vegetables, herbs. She had a small greenhouse she'd built herself in the 1980s out of salvaged glass and determination. She sold at the Charlottetown Farmers Market every Saturday from May to October, and she had done this until she was 77 years old, when her knees finally told her they were done. She was the only person in my family who ever treated me like my opinions were worth hearing. When I arrived at the house, my mother and Callum were already seated at the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize, who turned out to be the family's new solicitor. My aunt was there too, my mother's younger sister, sitting with her arms crossed and her mouth tight. My grandmother's house felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was just that the people in it made the air heavier. The solicitor opened a folder. My grandmother had left a will. Her house and the 1-acre lot it sat on went to my mother. The greenhouse structure and the adjacent quarter-acre of cultivated land, which she had separated legally from the main lot sometime in the 1990s, a fact none of us had known, went to me. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 seconds. I counted. Then my mother laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that is shaped like a compliment but lands like something else entirely. "Oh," she said, still smiling, "she left you the shed." Callum snorted. He tried to cover it with a cough, but he didn't try very hard. I looked at the documents in front of me, a quarter-acre of cultivated soil, a greenhouse that hadn't been used in 4 years, and a small structure that my grandmother had used as a potting shed and cold storage. The property shared a laneway with the main house, which meant my mother and I would technically be neighbors if I chose to keep it. The solicitor clarified that the greenhouse structure was in need of significant repair. The glazing on the south side had failed. There was a rodent problem. The boiler that had once heated the space had not functioned since 2021. "You could probably sell it," my mother offered, in the tone of someone being generous. "Maybe get 40,000 for the land. It's not zoned for residential. It would be a favor to whoever takes it off your hands, really." I nodded. I said I would think about it. What I did not say was that I had already been thinking about it for 8 months, ever since my grandmother pulled me close 2 weeks before she died and told me quietly that she had made sure I wouldn't be left out. She had not told me what she was leaving me. She had just said, "Don't sell it immediately, love. Give it a season. You'll know what you're looking at." I drove back to my apartment in Summerside that night and I did not sleep. I lay on top of my covers with my laptop open, looking at PEI agricultural zoning regulations and greenhouse repair costs and market garden revenue data until 2 in the morning. Then I called my friend Bex, who is a contractor and who has never once in her life told me something was impossible before she'd at least looked at it. How bad is it? She asked when I described the greenhouse. Bad, I said. But not gone. Those are my two favorite categories, she said. When do you want to go look? We went the following weekend. The greenhouse was 120 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a potting shed attached on the north end and a small cold storage room built into the hillside behind it. The south-facing glazing had partially collapsed, the way Bex had warned me it might. Older greenhouse glass, no tempered panels, just years of expansion and contraction and one bad ice storm. But the frame was steel and it had held. The concrete floor was intact. The old hydronic heating system was salvageable if I replaced the boiler and replumbed two sections. Bex walked the whole thing twice without saying anything. Then she put her hands on her hips and looked at me. You know what this is, right? She said. Tell me, I said. It's a specialty crop operation waiting to happen, she said. Microgreens, gourmet mushrooms, heritage tomatoes, cut flowers. You've got south-facing glass, you've got electricity already run, you've got a cold room. If you can get this operational by February, you're hitting the early spring market before any outdoor grower in the province. I had about $19,000 in savings, which I had built slowly and carefully over 4 years of working as an environmental technician for a consulting firm while doing a part-time market garden on the side. It was not a lot of money. But Bex gave me a quote that came in at $14,000 for the essential repairs, and I found a reconditioned condensing boiler through a commercial kitchen equipment dealer in Moncton that came in under budget. I did not tell my mother what I was doing. I did not tell Callum. I took 2 weeks of vacation time in November and worked alongside Bex and her partner, replacing glazing panels, re-insulating the north end, installing grow lighting on a timer system. I seeded my first trays in early December, pea shoots, sunflower, radish microgreens, and by January I had my first small harvest ready for sale. I want to be honest with you about that first year, because the version of this story where everything goes smoothly is not the one that actually happened. I lost a full tray of basil seedlings to an unexpected cold snap in March when the boiler cycled out overnight. I undersold at the Charlottetown market for the first month because I didn't know how to price specialty crops, and a woman at the next stall gently told me I was undercutting the whole market. I had a disagreement with a restaurant buyer in May that cost me my first wholesale account. I cried in the car more than once, but I kept going. And by the following fall, 14 months after I had stood in that kitchen and heard my mother laugh, I had 3 wholesale restaurant accounts, a CSA subscription list of 42 households, and a net income from the greenhouse that had exceeded my day job salary for the first time. I hired a part-time assistant. I bought a proper delivery vehicle, a used refrigerated cargo van I found through a Kijiji listing in Moncton. I registered the business formally as a sole proprietorship and opened a dedicated business account. I started working with a business advisor through the PEI lending agency to look at expansion options, specifically whether I could acquire the leasehold on an adjacent parcel that my grandmother had once rented from a neighbor and that had recently come back onto the market. I was genuinely happy. For the first time in my adult life, I was doing something that was entirely mine, built from the ground up with my own hands and my own decisions, and no one in my family had had anything to do with it. That, of course, was when my mother called again. This time she didn't hang up. This time she talked for a long time. She told me that she had been watching what I was doing with the property, and she thought it was very impressive. She used the word impressive 3 times. She said she had always known I had it in me. She said Callum had been going through a difficult time lately. His brokerage had restructured and he'd been let go, and his wife had left him 6 months ago, and he was really in a tough spot. And she wondered if there might be room for him in what I was building. I asked her what she meant by room. She said she thought Callum could help with the business side, the financial planning, the client relationships. She said she knew how hard it was to run something alone, and she wanted to make sure I had support. I said I would think about it. I did not want to think about it. I did not want Callum anywhere near my business, but I made myself sit with it for a week before I responded, because I have learned over the years that the gap between my first emotional reaction and the thing I actually do is where my best decisions live. What I did at the end of that week was call my business advisor and have a long conversation about business structures, about what it meant to bring in a partner versus an employee, about what protections existed for the founding owner of a sole proprietorship in the event of a dispute. She walked me through several scenarios. She mentioned a particular structure that she had seen used effectively when a business owner wanted to appear accommodating while retaining full control. It involved creating a secondary numbered company with a specific mandate and a very narrow scope of authority. I will be honest, I did not fully understand all of it in the first conversation. I went home and read about it for 3 nights in a row. Then I called her back and asked her to walk me through it again. Then I called my mother and told her I had thought about it and that I was open to Callum being involved in a limited capacity. My mother arrived the following Saturday with Callum and a casserole dish. She walked into the greenhouse like she was seeing it for the first time, which she was, and she was quiet for longer than I expected. Callum looked around with his hands in his pockets and said it was a lot smaller than he'd imagined. My mother touched one of the tomato plants on the vine trellis and said she remembered her own mother planting tomatoes in this same spot 50 years ago. Then she sat down at the small table I used for farm paperwork and she said, "So here's what I'm thinking." What she was thinking, it turned out, was that the business should be formalized as a family company, that Callum should be named as a co-director, that the asset, meaning the quarter-acre and the greenhouse, should be transferred into the new corporate structure so that the whole thing could be managed properly. She said this would be better for taxes. She said it would give the business more credibility with lenders. She said a lot of things. I listened to all of it. I nodded in the right places. I asked questions that sounded like the questions of someone who was genuinely considering what she was hearing. At the end, I said I thought it sounded like a reasonable direction and that I would have the paperwork drawn up. What I did not say was that the paperwork had already been drawn up by my business advisor and a solicitor I had retained 2 weeks earlier, and that it was not the paperwork my mother was imagining. There were 2 documents. The first was an incorporation agreement for a numbered company, I'll call it the holding company, that would hold the physical assets of the property. The second was a separate operating agreement for the greenhouse business itself, which would remain a sole proprietorship in my name, licensing the use of the property from the holding company at a nominal rate. The holding company had 2 shareholders on paper, me with 51% and Callum with 49%. What the document also specified, in language that my solicitor told me was standard, but that I made her explain to me 3 times before I signed anything, was that the 49% share carried no voting rights on asset decisions and no authority to encumber or transfer the physical property. Callum's share was a financial interest only. He would receive a portion of any profit distribution if I chose to make one. But he had no ability to do anything with the land or the greenhouse without my explicit sign-off. My solicitor told me I should make sure Callum read the full document before signing. I told her I would absolutely make sure of that. I printed 2 copies. I drove to my mother's house on a Thursday evening. Callum was there, eating dinner. I sat at the table and put the documents down and I said, I had the incorporation drawn up. This is the structure I'm proposing. My mother put on her reading glasses and looked at the first page. She saw the word co-director next to Callum's name and her face relaxed. Callum flipped to the signature page. I said, you should read the whole thing before you sign. My mother said, it's fine, she had a lawyer do it. Callum signed. I took my copy, said goodnight, and drove home. For the next 3 months, very little changed on the surface. Callum came by the greenhouse twice, looked around, made some suggestions about rebranding the packaging that I thanked him for and did not implement. My mother called occasionally to check in, and those calls had a warmth to them that I hadn't heard in years. She told me she was proud of what I had built. She said the family was lucky to have me. It was strange to hear. I let myself feel something about it for a couple of days. Then I put it aside and went back to work. What I had not told my mother, and what Callum did not know because he hadn't read the documents he signed, was that the numbered holding company had been formally registered with a specific liability clause attached to the land. This was something my solicitor had flagged as unusual. She'd asked me twice whether I was sure, but it was legal and I was sure. The clause stated that any regulatory violations or municipal compliance failures related to the physical property would be the joint and several responsibility of all shareholders. In October, the municipality conducted a routine inspection of agricultural properties in the area, following a complaint about a neighboring operation. My property passed without issue. My property was clean, compliant, and well-maintained. I had made sure of that. What my mother's house was not, as it turned out, was compliant. The main residential lot, which my mother had let slide on 2 cycles of required septic upgrades, had a file open with the province that she had been ignoring for over a year. When the municipal inspector pulled records during the area review, they flagged the shared laneway between the two properties and, following standard procedure, notified all parties with any registered interest in the connected parcels of the outstanding compliance requirement. Because Callum had signed as a shareholder in the holding company that held the greenhouse property, which shared that laneway, his name appeared in the notification as an interested party. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon, voice tight, wanting to know what was going on. I explained as calmly as I could that there was an outstanding septic compliance issue on the main residential property, my mother's property, that the province was requiring to be rectified. Because the laneway was shared and the properties were connected in the municipal record, all interested parties in the adjacent parcels had been notified as a procedural formality. It did not mean he was responsible for my mother's compliance failure. It meant he had been notified as the documents he had signed required. He said, "What documents? What does that even mean? I'm a director. I shouldn't be getting letters from the province." I said, "You're a shareholder in the holding company. The laneway is registered as shared access. The notification is standard procedure. If you're concerned, you're welcome to get your own solicitor to review your position." He said some things after that. I let him say them. Then I asked him if he had read the incorporation agreement before he signed it. There was a long pause. "Mom said it was fine," he said. "I told you to read it," I said. "I said that directly to you at the table." He said some more things. I stayed very quiet. That evening, my mother called. Her voice had lost the warmth of recent months. She said Callum was very upset. She said I had tricked him. She said she thought we were building something together as a family, and instead I had set a trap. I let her finish. Then I said, "Mom, I offered Callum a minority financial interest in a holding company. I printed the documents, I drove to your house, I put them on the table, and I told him to read them before he signed. You were sitting right there, you told him it was fine." She said that I knew he wasn't good with legal language. I said, "I know, that's why I told him to read it." She said I was being cruel. She said I had always been difficult. She said she didn't understand how her own daughter could do this to her family. I let her say all of it. Then I said, "The septic issue on your property has nothing to do with me or my business. That's been open with the province for 14 months. You need to deal with it. Callum's solicitor can confirm that his position in the holding company doesn't extend to your residential lot." I heard her exhale. "You've changed," she said. "It was not meant as a compliment." "I know," I said. The compliance issue on my mother's property cost her approximately $11,000 to rectify, a combination of the required septic upgrades and the municipal fine for the period of non-compliance. Callum hired a solicitor who confirmed, within 2 weeks, that his shareholder position in my holding company created no personal liability for him in relation to the residential lot. The provincial's notification had been procedural, just as I had told him. But the process of getting that confirmation took time and cost him money, and during those 3 weeks Callum experienced, in a very small and very administrative way, what it feels like to receive a piece of paper that tells you something significant is happening and that you do not fully understand your own position. He did not come back to the greenhouse after that. My mother did once. In early December, on a morning when the light through the repaired glazing was clean and white, and the tomato vines were heavy with the last fruit of the season, she stood at the edge of the growing beds and she looked at what I had built. The tiered shelves of microgreen trays, the propagation station, the hand-lettered chalkboard by the door where I tracked which restaurants were getting what, which CSA boxes had gone out. She didn't say anything for a while, then she said, "Your grandmother would have loved this." "I know," I said. "She told me she would." My mother looked at me. "When?" "2 weeks before she died," I said. "She told me not to sell it right away. She said to give it a season." My mother was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller somehow, than I had heard it before. "She always knew, didn't she? About you." I did not answer that directly. There are some things that don't need to be said out loud to be understood. What I will tell you is this: I am not angry at my mother. I am not sure I ever really was. What I felt for most of my life was something closer to grief, the specific grief of being looked past by someone who should have been looking at you. That kind of grief does something to you if you let it fester. I spent a long time letting it fester. What changed was not my mother. She is who she has always been. What changed was that I stopped waiting for her to see me and started building things that were worth seeing. My grandmother knew that. She left me a broken greenhouse and a quarter-acre of frozen PEI soil in November, and she trusted me to understand what she was giving me. Not just the land, the permission. The proof that someone who loved me had seen exactly who I was and had made a deliberate, legal, notarized decision to put something in my hands. That is worth more than any luxury apartment in any city. I still run the greenhouse. I have expanded onto the adjacent parcel I mentioned. The lease came through in the spring, and I've converted part of it to outdoor production for summer crops. My CSA list is at 91 households now. I have 6 wholesale accounts. I hired a second part-time employee in August, a young woman who is studying agriculture at Jumpy, and who reminds me a little of myself a decade ago, driven and a little uncertain and not quite sure yet what she is capable of. I tell her the same thing my grandmother told me. Give it a season. You'll know what you're looking at.